Welcome back, guys. I just want to do a video on the book Blink by Malcolm Gladwell. Super interesting book. I've read it a couple of times, and the subtitle is The Power of Thinking Without Thinking, which is really cool because we all are constantly, running things through our brains, and we're just navigating this life, and a fair amount of it is just purely unconscious. Like, we've experienced certain things a number of times, therefore we've got these ideas running through our brains that we don't even think about anymore. And he goes into these various topics where experts could pick out things like a top tennis coach could predict a double fault almost 100% of the time, but he didn't know why. He couldn't say it was because the throw was off, or his feet were wrong, or his backstroke was. He was just able to say double fault, and it would happen. But he couldn't pick out why, and it would keep him up all night wondering why. There's another one where a marriage counselor, John Gottman, you've probably heard of him. He's written several books. But he can watch a couple discuss sort of a controversial issue in their marriage, but that is not necessarily about their marriage, right? So, like, the example they use is like a couple talking about whether or not they should keep their dog or have a dog. The man doesn't like the dog or doesn't want the dog, and the woman loves the dog and whatever. He could watch them debate that conversation for 3 minutes, and then with 90% accuracy, or greater than 90, he could tell you if they'll be married 7 years from now. He lists four major reasons. What were they? I'll try and find them real quick. The four major things he looks for. They are defensiveness, stonewalling, criticism, and contempt. And the biggest indicator is the contempt. And the interesting thing is that the amount of contempt in your marriage is directly related with how often people get sick and stuff like that. Not to say that every time your coworker shows up sick that you can say, oh, it's because your husband or wife is... but anyways, it's an interesting thing how that affects our physical bodies, right? Which is a whole other conversation. But the things you're around and the people you're around and the food you eat and the ideas that come to your head affect your physical body. So that's why, you always hear these people talking about, like, surround yourself with good people, get good mentors, good friends, people that uplift you. Because it's not just about, like, your thoughts. It affects every area of your life. Another piece that I really liked was that he said we have a storytelling problem. And we're a bit too quick to come up with explanations for things we don't really know. And that comes in a chapter that was about, like, speed dating. People would tell a story about who they want to marry, who they're looking for, and then they would go through the process and really connect with a couple people, and it would be very different from their original explanation. But when they were asked why this person was attractive or whatever, they just had a different explanation. And in their brain, it was like, oh yeah, I already knew I wanted that. It was totally different. Let's see, a couple other good points in this book. Talks about, like, complex issues, like police chases or police, what do you call them, like pullovers or whatever, where things go wrong versus things go right? And some of them end up in, like, a shooting or some tragic event, and others are basically not an event at all. And typically it comes from slowing it down, doing the steps, using your cover and your intelligence versus sort of acting, acting powerful or whatever and speeding it up. So when people speed it up, mistakes get made. People get really frustrated, angry, heart rates go up. So they found that when your heart rate is between 115 and 145, you perform at optimal levels. So like a lot of athletes and stuff work in that heart rate range, and they're super good. When police officers can slow it down, their heart rate stays in that range, and they can make snap judgments that are really, really good. But once you hit like 175, your heart rate gets up to that point. You have cognitive breakdown, and certain centers of your brain basically just shut down. And that's why they'll describe an officer in a situation where he can describe with extreme detail things that you normally couldn't, like an officer shooting a guy and he can explain where the bullets are hitting, which like these are fraction of a second type things, but he's like literally seeing this happen. You can't do that normally. Like if you've ever shot a gun, you shoot it and then you look later, see where like unless the dust flies or something, you can't really, like you can't see that. It's too quick. But when your heart rate gets so high and your adrenaline's pumping so much, your brain shuts down and functions differently. And that's why people will totally forget about. So at the end of a high-speed chase, everyone's heart rates are super high. They run in there, they make all these mistakes. It ends up being a brawl and a lawsuit and all this stuff. And had they just slowed it down and stayed calm, they wouldn't have had the same type of thinking patterns, and it would have been different. So it's really interesting how certain types of training come into play, because this is all about keeping your brain in a certain space. Let's see. Priming was one of my one of the interesting things, and I think of that for business, right? So you can prime people. They did several studies at a college where they would have students come in and like try and write a sentence with some scrambled words, and it didn't really necessarily make sense, but within all these scrambled sentences were just key words like old, feeble, slow, all these things that would be maybe mentioned when you're talking about like a retirement community or something, right? And then after they were, to walk down a hall or whatever, and they performed the ones that had the words that were kind of old, did the task far, like much slower than the others. And so they did a few other experiments with similar type of, scenarios and whatever. And so like you can prime people to behave or react a certain way, which for business, you want, positive outcomes. You want them to sort of get on the boat with you and go where you're trying to go to, So really interesting about priming, and they even get into some social things about like race. We're all already primed with racial differences, right? Just because of the culture that we live in, the things we see on TV, the way people talk, the different areas that we see people typically in, even if that doesn't represent our society as a whole, we're still primed that way to think that way. Even if when we stop and think about it, we wouldn't react differently to this, black man versus this white man or this Hispanic or whatever. Even if we're, when we stop and consciously think or make decisions out in public, we're not affected by our primed, instinct. But when you have to make snap judgments or snap reactions, it comes into play. And so it was really interesting, even to the point where African American students, when they were asked to specify their ethnicity before their college entry exam, the ones who specified their ethnicity before got half as many questions correct as the ones who never had to even think about it. So the interesting thing is, even, you know, like even these African American kids have been primed to think that there's something wrong with that. Um, it had nothing to do with their native intelligence. It was the priming that they had. So some crazy, crazy things in this book, and there's a ton more. I mean, it's a fairly thick book of just dense information. So it was a fun read. If you want to get that, I'll put a link below to take you straight to Amazon. You can purchase that. But also I wrote a post on the website, so you can check that out. Go to bronsonwilks.com and read some highlights and things of the book that I thought were interesting. So anyway, thanks for stopping by, and we'll catch you next time.